Who am I and what is... Who am I? Well, yes, what is my reality? I don't think I have a ready answer. I mean, I could try an answer. If you mean what is it like to be me, it's exactly what it's like to be you. One of the things I've noticed going around doing these kinds of talks is that I truly believe that any one of you could do this. The great frustration of my own life is that I am not a great painter, a great artist, because we need to send people who can paint what they see, who can, through computers and sculpture and whatever, carry the message back. The other thing that I think psychedelics teach, if you do it, this is not what it teaches the first time, but if you give your life to it, it teaches you that death is not dissolution. It teaches you to overcome the one truth that we all accept from science, which is that when you die, you're compost, and that's it. I don't believe it. I think psychedelics secure the existence of the human personality beyond death. And that alone would justify the whole razzmatazz, I think.
Perhaps in this body,
yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think the body is the placenta of the soul. And that when the soul is finished, it can sever its connection to the body. We can bury the body under the apple tree, and the soul will then proceed with its career in a dimension that we cannot even conceive of.
Well, I'm aware of how late in the day it is, and I know some of you must be double parked, so I'll make this as succinct as possible. This morning's discussion caused me to wonder how much we would understand about electricity if our method of studying it was to stand on the tops of high hills and wait to be struck by lightning. It seems to me that's sort of the position that we're in vis-a-vis the UFOs. We have no real theory. We have conjectures. We have fiercely defended hypotheses, but we have very little that is concrete to go on. It's almost as though the issue of the UFO were an onion, and as we peel the layers of the onion, we discover when we get to the center that there is nothing there whatsoever left. It reminds me that if you cross an onion with a UFO, what you get is a flying saucer that brings tears to your eyes. Squeezed toward the production of the transcendental object at the end of time, which is nothing less than all time, all space, shrunk down to an atomic dimension and handed back to us. Do you see?
There's 4 months, 2 months, 1 month, 15 days, 7 days, the last 7 days, the last 3 days, the last day, the last 23 hours.
Basically, I've learned the way you control journalists is you give interviews. You give long interviews, deep interviews, and keep them and never let them write about you. You know, because when they start writing about you, it's ridiculous. So give interviews, and you can really control your spin that way.
We are down to 2 more in the list of St. Malachi before Doomsday.
While Malachi was struck by ecstatic visions, Nostradamus claimed to see the future by staring into a chalice of water. Their methods differed, but the vision was the same. The end of the church would mean the end of the world, and the end of the world would come soon after the year 2000. It's a dire prediction and a date within our lifetime that has been embraced by modern-day mystics.
I mean a great change. I don't mean the 5-cent cigar or Medicare reform. I mean ordinary space and time is going to disappear.
Terence McKenna is an author and explorer who lives on the big island of Hawaii, where he awaits what he believes will be the end of the world as we know it. For McKenna and hundreds of people who have come to embrace his apocalyptic warning, the doomsday clock will run out on a very specific date.
I predict the most novel event in the history of the world in 2012. And for a conservative mind, that might look like doomsday. But it isn't doomsday. It's simply that we are moving deeper and deeper into uncharted territory, novel territory. And that's frightening to some people and exhilarating to others.
While McKenna's message is much like that of Malachi and Nostradamus, his medium is decidedly 21st century. McKenna's crystal ball is a personal computer running software of his own design called Timewave Zero.
I believe that we have in fact discovered the structure of time itself.
McKenna developed Timewave Zero in 1970 after studying the ancient Chinese fortune-telling system known as the I Ching.
And out of that came a mathematical algorithm that obviously wanted to be a calendar. And when I looked at it as a calendar, I saw that it described the ebb and flow of change in history.
When McKenna placed the I Ching's pattern of peaks and valleys over the timeline of history, he made a startling discovery. When the I Ching system dipped, so did the fortunes of the planet.
Here, 1356, the Black Death, a third of the population of Europe, dies. And here, the culmination of the Italian Renaissance in 1492 with the discovery of the New World. Over here, the American and the French revolutions. Here's World War II, and here's us.
Because his computer system provides a remarkably accurate picture of the past, McKenna is confident it will prove to be an accurate picture of the future as well.
So the predictions of the past give us confidence that what it's saying about the future will also turn out to be true.
On December 21st, 2012, the time wave dips off the chart and into infinity. McKenna does not know what will occur on that date, only that it will be the most significant point in human history.
One of my guesses is that what we will discover in 2012 that will make this true is time travel. If technologies that could move through time were developed around that time, it would explain why the wave could no longer give a linear description of the unfolding of events, because the unfolding of events would go non-linear at that point.
Nearly 500 years ago, Nostradamus predicted similar changes in the time-space continuum that would occur soon after the year 2000.
He sees a change in mankind, a new humanity, a new culture that ultimately leads to the human race leaving the planet Earth. They're living in the planets of the constellations Cancer and Aquarius. So when you look up tonight at the sky and you see the stars of the Aquarius constellation, you're seeing the future of humanity.
The mind to rove and scan in a much more expansive domain of information than is normally the case. I mean, if you don't smoke cannabis, you may spend your evening balancing your check account. If you do smoke cannabis, you may spend your evening contemplating the causes of the Greek Renaissance. More money has been spent trying to find something wrong with cannabis than any other vegetable material in human history. And what they've come up with is so pathetically thin that I am confident that it amounts to a clean bill of health for this stuff. Cannabis is not a health problem. The problem is that it promotes social values and attitudes which are unwelcome in capitalist market-based society. It's just that simple. A drug like coffee, with a horrendous health profile compared to cannabis, is completely welcomed into the marketplace and the home and the lifestyle of modern people. This is simply that we value certain states of mind and we fear and suspect others. And this is based entirely on value systems that are inculcated from above.
Here we are, backstage.
Lost the last. Hi, Tom. Terence McKenna.
That's Terence and Nick Gerber. You know Nick?
Yeah.
Make sure you connect. We're not monsters, Terence. We're not monsters. Turn me on the inside out, make the inner worlds outer and the outer air. We know
In fact, what do you make of this Anton Zellinger character, the Institute for Quantum Cryptography?
The guy who's teleporting larger and larger things. Caltech has done them one better. Caltech is teleporting macroscopic objects already.
You saw this?
Oh, it was in Science last month.
You know, macroscopic objects meaning what? A molecule?
No, not a molecule. No, a lot of light. Light. A bunch of light in a particular quantum state.
Well, what do you make of this?
Well, it's going to be a long way before we have teleportation.
What if that weren't true?
What wasn't true?
That it isn't a long way before we have teleportation. What if it were 5 years out?
There's a catch. It's not faster than light. They teleport your substance faster than light, but they need a slower than light signal to decode it. Otherwise, it doesn't get
information about what it is running slower. Well, then where are you while they're waiting for the light speed?
We're going to have to find out about that. Where's your mind? I don't know. But so there is a catch. They can teleport something that could be turned into you once a certain code.
But it means that within the solar system, or the planetary surface, this is only of technical interest, and the thing is like an operable miracle.
At the moment, but remember, light speed subjectively is instantaneous.
Right.
If you travel at light speed, it doesn't seem like anything is happening. So subjectively, this teleportation could be instantaneous. It would take 4 years. Someone watching you would see it take 4 years. But for you would step into the teleportation booth and end up on Alpha Centauri like that.
But you have to send a receiver ahead, right? You have to actually send a physical object, which is the receiver. And once so you have the problem delivered all over again. Except you don't have to deliver biology to the star. You just have to deliver technology to the star.
Remember, in Contact, all they sent was the blueprints. They sent us the blueprints and we were able to build it. So
but that's because they knew we were there. We can't assume that about Alpha Centauri.
Well, I'm working on mental contact with those fuckers, you know. I mean, watch
Your Stellarator?
No, Stellarator. That was a primitive. No, what to tell you about the Stellarator?
It's lovely. It's lovely, the Stellarator.
But some variant on the Stellarator will work, Terence. I swear.
I believe you.
Study the potential effects that Alpha Centauri's light and the energy connected with whatever was there.
If there were a water-rich oxygen world, I think it would incredibly focus the historical intent. I mean, the primate desire for open space would believe that, it would be paradise. Everyone would believe it was paradise instantly. And all of society would bend its will to go out there.
Now maybe there's a galactic something like that where people focus their minds and get in contact with other beings. If I focus my mind on, say, Sirius.
5 grams in silent darkness, right?
No, I'm talking about some stellar object. But I'm open to chemical beings.
Quantum mechanically mediated
Contact with extraterrestrials.
via submolecular.
No, mental. We would do the astral channel first.
drug molecules, their structures are important. It has to do, they are like antennas and transmitters. It's all a tinker toy world of essentially nanotechnological natural objects.
I agree.
Yep.
The universe is a novelty-producing engine of some sort. And the further you move from the birth of the universe, the more novel the universe becomes until you arrive here tonight. This is the most novel moment to date in the history of the universe. It is not only a world of astrophysical forces, or a world of astrophysical forces plus organic chemistry, or astrophysical forces, organic chemistry plus biology. But this is a world that has all the levels of novelty that have accumulated throughout the career of the evolving universe. Each level built on the level which preceded it. And one thing I want to point out about this is that this is the first, if you agree with this, then the first payoff is that suddenly human importance is taken back from the scientific view that we are the chancely evolved witnesses of a meaningless process in an ordinary corner of a universe too vast to conceive or imagine. That incredibly disempowering picture of who we are in the cosmos is misled. The actual facts of the matter are that in our bodies, in our brains, in the culture that we have assembled, all the novelty that preceded us has been exploited and is expressed and is honored. We then begin to look like partners in the project of the production of novelty and more novelty and yet greater novelty. Okay. That's the first fact which science overlooked, the conservation of novelty. The second fact that science overlooked is more of a stretch in terms of the break with the past style of thinking that it requires. The second fact, which science overlooked, is the fact that each advance into novelty, each new level of novelty occurs faster than the level which preceded it. This is incredibly important because what it means is that the culmination of the novelty-producing process could be far closer to us in time than we might ordinarily suppose using scientific assumptions about reality. And those of you who have heard me before have heard me say, history is the shock wave of eschatology. What that means is that the presence of ourselves on this planet, using culture, using language, transferring information electronically around the world, our presence on the planet means that the universal process of novelty production has entered one of its very short cycles. And so what it means is that asymptotic acceleration of change is built into the structure of space-time itself in this region of the cosmos. History is ending.
time is literally running out on this planet, and it isn't about political mistakes or anything where we should blame ourselves. It's in the structure of the fabric of space-time itself. And the proof of this is ourselves, because the emergence of conscious human beings out of advanced primates occurred with such explosive suddenness that it, like history, argues that we are in the presence of a process that is quickly beginning to accelerate and cross boundary level after boundary level as it bursts through to greater and greater degrees of freedom. So I believe that we are actually preparing to decamp from ordinary history. I don't know exactly what that means, but the continuation of history for decades, centuries, millennia is inconceivable. That is the hallucination of the establishment.
But I think, that the CIA and the KGB, surely these things were studied. I mean, we don't know what happened to all that psychedelic research. We know that MK Ultra lasted up until about 1970, and nobody ever asks the question, what happened after what we know about? Mm-hmm. The story they put out was that, it just didn't work out, and it seemed sort of silly, and it was all over the place. But knowing what we know about it, how is this possible?
Have they ever approached you?
Not so far as I could tell.
Mm-hmm. Now here's a very large specimen of ayahuasca.
Hier ist ein sehr großes Exemplar der Ayahuasca-Ranke. Der hat diesen abgestorbenen Baum völlig überwuchert. Es ist der weltgrößte halluzinogene Pflanze. Was wir hier sehen, sind ganze Tonnen von alkaloidhaltigem Pflanzenmaterial. Es ist die klassische Pflanze des Schamanismus am Oberlauf des Amazonas. Und die Quechua-Indianer sagen, es sei die Leiter zum Mond, das Boot, das sie zum Zentrum der Milchstraße führe.
That carries them to the center of the Milky Way. Perhaps.
Vielleicht.
This is a birth control sedge.
Dies ist ein Gras, das der Geburtenkontrolle dient. Es ist viel darüber geschrieben worden. Es heißt Chikurupiripiri. Es wird noch erforscht, aber es steht fest, dass es die Eingeborenen von Pucallpa als Verhütungsmittel benutzen.
Inmitten des tropischen Regenwaldes von Hawaii betreut der Ökologe und Schamanenwissenschaftler Terence McKenna die Stiftung Botanical Dimension. Ethnomedizinische Pflanzen aus allen Teilen des globalen Tropengürtels werden hier auf einem 98 Hektar großen Waldstück angepflanzt, um sie zu erforschen und vor dem Aussterben zu bewahren.
This gives you an idea of the density and complexity of the Hawaiian climaxed forest.
Hier bekommt man einen Eindruck von der Dichte und Komplexität des hawaiianischen Urwalds. Wir wissen, dass diese tropischen Wälder voll von chemisch interessanten und medizinisch wirksamen Pflanzen sind. Der Amazonas, die Wälder von Chiapas, von Bali, von Guatemala, von Hawaii, von Assam, von Westirian, all diese tropischen Ökosysteme sind bedroht. Wenn einmal eine Spezies ausgelöscht ist sie für immer verschwunden.
It's gone forever. It's a unique thing in the universe.
Diese Heilpflanzen sind seit ewigen Zeiten eingebunden in den menschlichen Lebenszusammenhang. Sie wurden ständig gesammelt, miteinander gekreuzt und wegen ihrer jeweiligen Wirkungsweisen wiedergesammelt. Diese Pflanzen repräsentieren das spirituelle Erbe tausender Jahre von Jäger- und Sammlerkultur. Aber wir verstehen sie nicht als Produkt unserer Kultur, so wie wir ein Flugzeug oder ein Auto als Kulturgut betrachten.
The most existentially real part of so-called ancient knowledge.
Der wesentlichste und wirklichste Teil sogenannten alten Wissens ist wahrscheinlich, was die Leute über Pflanzen wussten, da sie in solch enger Verbindung mit ihnen lebten. Wir sehen uns gern als eine Spezies von Jägern, aber in Wirklichkeit war das Jagen und Fangen von rohem Fleisch eher ein seltenes Ereignis, gemessen an der Zeit, die aufgewendet wurde, um Wurzeln, Beeren, Blätter und Nüsse zu sammeln.
Shamanism is basically the worldwide Paleolithic religion of natural magic based on trance, dance, and intoxication. Practicing capitalistic high-tech consumer culture for another 50 years will literally leave the planet a burnt-out husk. I see this whole dance, tribal rave culture that is beginning to take hold as a kind of desperate corrective response to the kind of social forms that are pushing us toward wreck and ruin. We're headed for a rave new world, if you will.
The reason the Amazon rainforest is so species dense and so highly integrated is because speciation and natural selection have been going on uninterrupted for 220 million years. That's why you can starve to death in an Amazonian rainforest, because no plant elaborates free protein. There aren't luscious fruits and wonderful fleshy things, because anything which produced those kinds of organs would be non-competitive in such a tight environment. And one of the strange things about an Amazonian or Indonesian rainforest is there is no organic material that is not alive. Something like 5% of the organic material is non-living. So what that means is if a leaf falls, within 40 minutes, it's in the gut of ants, it's being chewed up by slugs, it's being degraded by bacteria. There's no such thing as detritus on the forest floor the way there is in a temperate monocultural forest like we're familiar with.
Do you think personally that there are compellingly good reasons for trying to do something like this?
Well, I'm interested in whole systems and forest ecosystemics and stuff like that, and obviously being able to model these things is the final proof that you actually understand the processes. Maybe the thing to model would be to start with, this would satisfy all kinds of people and really get you a lot of fancy experts helping you. An anthill. A forest anthill. This raises problems in communication theory because of the pheromone angle. It raises problems in insect modeling, macrophysical modeling. There would be then spin-offs. I mean, modeling an ant society has implications for urban planning and traffic control and language study. And Wilson suggests that this ability to concentrate food production within the confines of the nest deep underground actually is what gave these ants their evolutionary leg up. And he compares it to the invention of agriculture. He says the invention of agriculture in human societies led very directly to urbanization, the building of walled cities, the production of agricultural surplus, and he compares it to this adaptation invented 600 million years earlier, where these mushroom-growing ants were able to essentially take themselves out of the stream of the natural selective pressure of the environment by creating an ant-defined environment underground in which they are able to call the shots, and that's really what civilization is.
If you want to see an anthill in VR, you've got to be an ant.
You've got to be an ant. And then an ant's an appreciation for ants carries with it an automatic appreciation for the microphysical world generally, and forms of communication and values that are at first sight alien. But on the other hand, ants have been around since the Devonian, so they must know something about societal stability and equilibrium and resource management and those sorts of things that we could use to know. You know, an anthill is a mind, and each ant can be thought of as a nerve cell, but the interface between them can be thought of as a synapse into which they produce pheromone of different sorts to fire information across the gap that separates the distinct ants. So you would probably find that your modeling of the anthill was turning into a kind of prototype model of all kinds of complex electrochemical systems.
I grew up in western Colorado, and we prided ourselves on being Westerners. Every time I come south, I realize that the place where I grew up was south, but like schizoid about it, and never owned up to the fact that the psychology of North Carolina is more what western Colorado is about than the psychology of Southern California by any stretch. Anyway, not to wander, I grew up in this place, and I was curious. And I think curiosity is the psychedelic virtue. It's the precondition for finding your way into the presence of this answer, intellectual curiosity. And I was told, well, you know, there were dinosaurs here 100 million years ago, and 50 million years before that there was an ocean here. And we would go out into the dry arroyos and sandstone country, and here would be these seashells and spiral ammonites and stuff. And I was obsessed with the sea because I had never seen it. I didn't see the ocean until I was 14 years old. And yet here was evidence of the ocean in some of the driest and most shattered desert country you could ever see. And so I got the message, and the message is the world is not what it appears to be. Where there are deserts, one finds evidence of oceans. Where there are wastelands, one finds evidence of jungles. And by extension, where there is love, one can uncover animosity and conflict. Where there is hate, one can uncover love and community. So very early I got the notion things are not as they appear to be.
When I take psychedelics, I always do it in a shamanic style, usually at night, usually alone, in nature if possible, and then I watch. I pay very close attention. I use my mind as an alchemical vessel for carrying out observations on the union of spirit, my personality, and matter, the physical matter of the substance that I'm ingesting. Nothing in human experience is as much like the singularity as a psychedelic experience. In a way, it's a microcosmic anticipation of this macrocosmic event in history. When we take psychedelics, we undergo a mini apocalypse, a mini revelation, and it positions us then for these larger events in the historical time stream.
I explored the red sandstone bluffs yesterday and violated my own rule and actually did take a little psilocybin, just a tiny bit, just to help me sort of understand the landscape. And since today we're going to talk about ecology, it was sort of, I figured, part of the business end of things to do that. the reason I went to the effort to get the aerial photograph of Rustler's Valley up so you could see it was simply because on my very light mushroom trip yesterday, I went down the face of the bluff and then up onto the bluff, and then I just sat there, and I had no real expectation. I mean, I was roughly interested in the botany, and then I just sat there and smoked a bomber and sort of considered the situation, and several thoughts came to me of a somewhat surprising to me, and it was about the land. And I've been puzzled ever since I've gotten here, because this whole journey has had a kind of funny personal element in it, in that this place is more like where I grew up than any place I've ever been. And I keep telling myself it's not so, that I'm not paying enough attention, and that there is nothing more irritating than the tourist who carries with him always the assumption of his home. But on the other hand, my relationship to the place where I grew up was not casual. I was a rock hunter, a fossil hunter. I spent a lot of time alone in the sandstone country, looking at it from a distance like this, you know, and picking at it and climbing around. And I can't shake the impression that I'm within 50 miles of where I was born. And if any of you ever have the opportunity, go to western Colorado, to places like Montrose, Delta, Delta County, Pitkin County. It's this to a T. It's the land that is the same. Of course, the plants are totally different. And I concentrated yesterday a lot on looking at the identifiably exotic South African flora, which I'm sure you all take for granted, but things like the cabbage tree and the Pelospelus and the Caryodopsis, the little Caryodopsis plants up on the rocks and all of that. Very interesting. But then I had a sort of a hallucination about the place, or an understanding, and that's why I brought the map in. And this is an aerial photograph of the general area, and this is the valley. The house and all the complex and the buildings and everything is here, and the big stone bluff behind us is this thing. And maybe you were aware, but maybe you weren't all aware of how thin it is, how it's just a knife of stone. It's not a mountain range that begins behind us. It's a knife of stone that is quite as clear on the other side as it is on this side, because we hiked up and looked over, and there's more cultivation and so forth and so on. So I was thinking about how this is roughly a round valley, an enclosed valley, and valleys like that are always gather energy. It's like a trivial observation. They gather energy. The Kathmandu Valley is such a valley, a round valley. The Valley of the Sibundoy in Colombia, that Schultes called the site of the most highly evolved narcotic consciousness on Earth. He was speaking of the Brugmansia shaman, is a valley very similar to this, the Covelo Valley in Northern California. Anyway, not to put too fine a point on it, but my impression of this thing yesterday very strongly was that it's alive, and it's a beast. It's specifically and very obviously a dragon. And it guards this valley, and there's a very strong sense of its personality and intelligence. And I wonder if the local people haven't always perceived it that way. Certainly in Australia, it would have that kind of a character. So, that was just a couple of grams of mushrooms, no purpose, and walking around, and suddenly there was this whole new dimension to things. And this gives it very clearly. This is another whole new dimension to things, to look down on things. This is the shaman's eye view of Rustler's Valley, and the whole thing is clearly under the protection of this thing. And I'm sure in the late afternoon this must photograph very clearly from orbit, because it would throw a long extended shadow. So anyway, that's about as woo-woo as I'll get. It was a personal observation. I felt this thing very strongly. Beginner's luck. So, where we were, and let us continue.
The importance of virtual reality, as I see it, is a technology that will allow us to show each other our dreams. We will be able to build structures in the imagination that we cannot now share with each other. I imagine a world where children begin to build their virtual realities by the time they're 5, 6, 7. Well, by the time they're 20, these virtual realities may be, practically speaking, the size of Manhattan. Well, then what real intimacy will mean is saying to someone, would you like to visit my world? My world, with my visions, my values, my dreams, my fears. In a sense, what virtual reality is a strategy to let us turn ourselves inside out so that we see each other's minds. You know, octopi wear their minds on the outside of their bodies. Octopi communicate by changing colors and the smoothness of their bodies. They wear their meaning. We have an organ that we can do this with, but it's very limited. It's called a face. If you look at people's faces and you are open, you can see into the mind. But virtual reality is going to allow us to share much, much more of ourselves. After all, my reality is not how I look. My reality is who I am. And the only way I could give that to you is if I could invite you inside. So I think this hasn't much been said about virtual reality because it doesn't interest the commercial people who are developing it. But I think this is what it will eventually be. A tool for sharing our dreams and the insides of our heads.
Wish I had some of that stuff. Well, I was surprised to hear McLuhan invoked so many times today, and I will do it again. McLuhan had an idea of what he called the global village, and the global village is coming to be. This is what the crisis that is being presented to us as a crisis in communism is. It isn't a crisis for communism. Communism is going first. But what it is the death knell for centralized structure, for centralized If you think what we've been through in the past year is something, wait till you see what's on the agenda. And I don't mean great CNN feed from Moscow as the Soviet Union turns into 15 independent republics. I mean what's going to happen here. Because what is so terrifying about Gorbachev from the point of view of the powers that be is that he models a leader who can say, we did it wrong. Baker was on one of the talk shows after one of these we did it wrong statements by Gorbachev. And they said to him, well, under what circumstances would an official of the United States government admit a mistake? And he said, well, you don't understand. You see, we have a collective decision-making apparatus, and hence, we don't make mistakes. You see? So I think that, to return to McLuhan for a moment, what's happening is, as Yeats said in his poem, the center does not hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, but as fans of chaos, we should know that this mere anarchy is the incarnation of our goddess Discordia, who is going to pull down the hunky structure that is oppressing everybody. What I see happening, and it was touched upon by others here, is this intensification of local identification, bioregionalism, awareness of your immediate place, and then no hierarchical structure or identification until you reach the planetary level. I live in Sonoma County, and I am a citizen of Earth. I recognize no intermediate structures except when I have to. So I agree with Tim. I cheer on the people who present the protocols and plead their cases before these gray-faced medical boards. But in my opinion, you just circumvent all that. You go around it. It's irrelevant. History has these dominator types by the balls. You know, history is a psychedelic experience. It's the collective unfolding of the dream of our species in space and time. We are at the apex. This is the peak. This is the second hour of the trip. We're going over the top.
This is ground zero for the Rosicrucian Enlightenment. Standing here in the alchemical laboratory of the palace in Heidelberg,
We are essentially at the center of the alchemical hopes of the Rosicrucian Enlightenment. It was here in the years before the adventure in Bohemia that Frederick's alchemists, astrologers, and soothsayers toiled directly under the king's observation and control. Here came Michael Meyer, Heinrich Kundrath, the great names of alchemy. It's entirely possible that John Dee was in this room. It's entirely possible that Edward Kelly stood where I am standing now. It's almost impossible to conceive of the hopes and the fantasies and the labors and the dreams that have been generated by and are centered on this room and the objects in it. This is the last alchemical laboratory in the world to fully function before the rise of modern science. And these tools in many ways reflect the internal cosmology of the men and women who used them. This, for example, a typical alchemical distillery, is called the Pelican. Another example of the colorful nature of alchemical vocabulary. It's called the Pelican because it is associated with the myth of a bird which plucks blood from its own breast. The prima materia, feces, black coal, charcoal, salt niter, heated in here, brought to a high temperature, a fevered caloric state, rises into the higher empyrean of the vessel, and there, rarefied, it condenses, liquefies, and flows down into the cooler domain of the child of the pelican. Here the essence is collected, the quintessence, and always the hope was that the next experiment, the next combination of materials would yield the elixir vitae, the lapis philosophorum, the completion that the alchemist sought. And so all this fantastic apparatus that we see around us is really not so much in the service of channeling liquids, gases, but in the service of channeling spirit out of matter and into the higher realms, where it then can be refluxed, recondensed, and the lapis philosophorum, the stone of the philosophers, the central mystery, brought to completion. It's the self that we are trying to recover. This is lumina de lumina, the light trapped in matter, the lux natura. This is universal medicine, curing all ills. It is the answer. It is what everyone is looking for and no one can find. And so the alchemist toiled over the centuries, the torment of the sulfur, the torment of the cinnabar, the search for the triumphant chariot of antinomy, the search for the quintessential essence that represented the union of all the world that the alchemists saw around them. We have come to understand that the work of alchemy was not about the transmutation of crude metals into gold, but was in fact a kind of dance of the imagination in which the psychological complexes within the alchemist were mingled in an amalgam with chemical processes, creating a kind of mythology of matter,
a landscape in which the green lion, the red dragon, the hermaphroditic queen, the four-headed dog were figures moving to and fro in the fevered speculations of the so-called philosophers. And the belief was that man could work with nature, a full partner with the divine process, and redeem the light fallen into matter, and in so doing, redeem himself.
Hey, what do you say? There is a very important part of life which has been ignored by science, and because this is a scientific society we're locked inside of, we've gotten a distorted view of it, and that is there's a quality to reality that everybody can feel, everybody experiences, we all know it, and yet we get no reinforcement for its existence from the models that our culture venerates. And what I want to talk about is what I call novelty, or the appetite for complexity that permeates nature, that is in fact as fundamental a law of nature, if not more fundamental, than the laws of thermodynamics themselves. And this is the idea that nature loves complexity, and wherever it achieves complexity, in a membrane, in the center of a star, in an organism, in a breeding population of animals or plants, wherever it achieves complexity, it seeks to preserve it, and it seeks to use it as a platform for further complexity. This is what the universe is. It's a complexity-generating engine of some sort, on all levels, not only in biology, but in physics. If you look backward in time, the universe becomes more simple. 1 million years ago, there was no human civilization. 100 million years ago, there were very few mammals. 1 billion years ago, life had yet to emerge onto the land. 5 billion years ago, the planet itself was in the process of condensing. If you go back to the domain of the Big Bang, you find a world, a universe of pure electron plasmas, not even atomic systems, still less molecular systems. All that lies in the future. So in a sense, as the universe ages, as it cools, it complexifies. It becomes more novel. And biology on this planet, since we only know of its presence here and in a Martian meteorite discovered last summer, complexity on this planet finds its concrescence in animal life, still more in ourselves. The reason I mention this is because the scientific model of reality tells you that we are the chance-created witnesses of an essentially valueless universe. Chance and necessity. This is the chant of science. But looking at the record, it appears nature favors organization, favors complexity, and therefore favors ourselves. Because we represent animal complexity plus culture, plus phonetic alphabets, plus high technology. So the universe has put all of its eggs, or at least the processes of evolution on this planet, have
placed all their bets in the human world. But this raises the stakes, makes the situation far less existential, and makes what we do with our human freedom a matter of great import. It turns out we count. We are more than witnesses. We are more than victims. We are, in fact, co-creators of this universal tendency to complexification. And in the psychedelic experience, we see the culmination of this process, a kind of anticipation of ultimate complexity, where information is holographically embedded and all things become possible. All things are now possible in the human world. Reductionist biologists have said of life itself, it's a kind of iridescence on matter. Other people say mind, conscious mind, is a kind of iridescence on biology. These are all sort of ways to dismiss what we experience as most fascinating and most beautiful. You know, Plato linked the idea of the good, the true, and the beautiful. But it's hard to tell what is good, and it's hard to tell what is true. But it's not hard to tell what is beautiful. So if you follow beauty, I think you can be pretty clear that you're not going to fall too far from the path of righteousness. That's sort of what the psychedelic path is. It's the demand that things be more beautiful, more strange, more astonishing than they've ever been before. As we approach this evening, the world not only becomes more complex, but it moves faster and faster. You know the cliches. More change in the last 25 years than in the previous 100. More change in the last 100 than in the last 1,000. In the last 1,000, 10,000. Who can look at this process and assume it will ever stop? But who has looked at this process and asked themselves what will happen if it doesn't stop? Because if there has been more change in the last 20 years than in the previous 100, then in the next 5 there will be more change than in the last 1,000. And eventually you get to the notion of a universe that undergoes half of its evolutionary unfolding in the last hour and 35 minutes of its existence. This is, in fact, the kind of universe we are living in. What we have been told is that a process is pushed from behind by causal necessity, like a row of falling dominoes. Cause precedes effect. This is half the story. Half of what you see going on is simply the unfolding of causal necessity. But at a deeper level, the future is not simply empty space-time into which we are expanding. The future is pulling us toward itself. There is what I call the transcendental object at the end of time, or the eschaton, which means the last thing. The last thing is like an enormous attractor, which is pulling first biology, and then human history, and then the 20th century and all of our lives embedded in it, pulling us deeper and deeper into a relationship of self-reflection with it. In other words, we are being shaped by something literally unimaginable that lies ahead of us in time, that 3-4 million years ago gently took hold of the African primate line and began to sculpt it and move it along certain developmental pathways, all toward self-reflection of this thing. And now we are cosmic moments away from encountering this thing. This is what the excitement of shamanism worldwide is now. Shamans are people who can see the end in some sense. Not that the end is predetermined. When you look into the future, you don't see something like the past, except that it hasn't happened. When you look into the future, you see a storm of space-time vectors and probability matrices that have not yet undergone the formality of actually occurring. That's the business of the present moment, to collapse that hyperdimensional set of space-time vectors into a here and a now with a causal identity and a vector toward the future. But we are now so close to this transcendental object that has molded the entire destiny of this planet. We are now so close to it that all you have to do is smoke a bomber, close your eyes, take a walk in the bush, sit on the beach, pay attention to your dreams, watch your mind after orgasm, and you will see this thing peeping around the edges, creeping in at the side. I mean, was it Wordsworth who called it intimations of immortality? Something like that. We are not simply the victims of our past. This is the false truth of materialism and positivism. We are locked in an extremely mysterious relationship with something in another dimension, a dimension which, for want of a better word, we call the future. But in fact, this other dimension completely surrounds and encloses human history. This is what shamanism is about. Shamanism is where people step out of cultural time into what Marceliade called in ilio tempore, the time before, the sacred time, the paradigmatic time, dream time, we call it down here. It's the time which surrounds the smaller time of historical unfolding.
What is nature? What's unnatural?
Nothing is unnatural except some things are less intelligent than others. Everything has a design, but elegance of design is still a worthwhile value. Nature, the interesting thing about nature is the risks that she's willing to take. Like if you asked yourself, what does nature do best on this planet? The surprising answer is produces extinct species. 95% of all life that ever existed on this earth is extinct. That's what happens to life. What nature has been interested in is passing on complexification of form from species to species, genera to genera, over very long periods of time. And the fact that nature will tolerate our own dear selves as a part of the natural order indicates that nature is a far more reckless gambler than we are. Our impulse is to deny ourselves, hold back. Nature's impulse, apparently, is to put the pedal of creativity to the metal by taking a primate and pushing it to the wall, boxing it in, raising the pressure, and watching the entire planet bubble its way toward metamorphosis. The whole point of psychedelics is to throw you back on your own experience. It is not an ideology. It is an experience. It may spawn this or that ideological interpretation. Marxists have something to say, Freudians have something to say, but it's not theirs. It's yours. It belongs to the animal body. And why it's so important, is because it is a pipeline back to the greater order of nature, which I call the Gaian mind. It is the pipeline back toward a dynamic, a way of doing things that is profoundly natural, profoundly appropriate. This is why it was possible for human beings to live on this planet for 100,000, 200,000 years, possessing language, theater, humor, so forth and so on, everything we have, but not fucking up. Because they were embedded in, communicating with, aware of, and able to receive instruction from the Gaian intentionality.
My pleasure to introduce tonight's lecturer, Terence McKenna. With the release of his captivating new book, True Hallucinations, Terence McKenna has given many of us renewed hope that the philosopher's stone as fungus is finally within modernity's reach.
During this sleepless period, I sat one night on this laundry rock below the police house where Dennis was incarcerated, and he was more or less incarcerated because he refused to keep his clothes on, and anything put in a room with him he would hurl out the window. He even hurled the window frame out the window. So he was thorough. I said nothing to anyone, but I formed the resolve not to spend that sleepless night as I had spent the others, wandering the fields like the fox spirit or meditating at the Choro. Rather, I would sit here where the lake emptied and the Agara-Paraná resumed its languid course, here at the boat landing, 70 feet down a steep mud bank from the river house. I would sit through the night and watch. And so, all night long, I sat reviewing the things that had passed, seeming to divide my consciousness and send it both backward through my family tree and forward into the future. I seemed to see all the years ahead. I saw some technique emerging from this contact, which I now think is the technique for growing Stropharia cubensis. Our careers pursued across space and time, and finally vindication as the world realized the truth of the transdimensional nature of the Stropharia visions and the true nearness of the worlds that they had thrown open. For it had become my belief that the contact with an intelligent and utterly alien species was beginning for humanity. It seemed that out of the long night of cosmic time, the novelty of novelties, the moment of contact between minds on utterly different planes was beginning. We were among the first to achieve contact with this other species. It was the real thing. We had come to the equatorial jungle to explore the dimensions glimpsed in tryptamine ecstasy, and there, in the darkness of the heart of the Amazon, we had been found and touched by this bizarre and ancient life form that was now awakening to the global potential of a symbiotic relationship with technical humanity. All night long, strange vistas and insights poured through me. I saw gigantic machineries and worlds of vegetable and mechanical forms on scales inconceivably vast. Time, agatized and glittering, seemed to pour by me like living superfluids inhabiting dream regions of terrible pressure and super cold. And I saw the plan, the mighty plan, at last. It was an ecstasy, an ecstasis that lasted hours and placed the seal of completion on all of my previous life. At the end, I felt reborn, but as what? I knew not. In the gray of a false dawn, the wave of internal imagery faded away. I rose from where I had been sitting for hours and stretched. The sky was clear, but it was still very early and stars were still shining dimly in the west. In the southeast, the direction toward which my attention had been focused, the sky was clear except for a line of fog or ground mist lying parallel to the horizon only a few feet above the treetops on the other side of the river, perhaps a half a mile away. As I stretched and stood up on the flat stone where I had been sitting, I noticed that the line of fog seemed to have grown darker and now seemed to be churning or rolling in place. I watched very carefully as the rolling line of darkening mist split into two parts, and each of these smaller clouds also divided apart. It took only a minute or so for these changes to be executed, and I was now looking at 4 lens-shaped clouds of the same size lying in a row and slightly above the horizon, only a half mile or so away. A wave of excitement swept through me, followed by a wave of definite fear. I was glued to the spot, unable to move, as if in a dream. As I watched, the clouds recoalesced in the same way they had divided apart, taking another few minutes. The symmetry of this dividing and rejoining, and the fact that the smaller clouds were all the same size, lent the performance an eerie air, as if nature herself were suddenly the tool of some unseen organizing agency. As the clouds recoalesced, they seemed to grow even darker and more opaque. As they all became one, the clouds seemed to swirl inward like a tornado or a waterspout, and it flashed into my mind that perhaps it was a waterspout, something I still have never seen. But even as the thought formed, I heard a high-pitched, ululating whine come drifting over the jungle treetops, obviously from the direction of the thing I was watching. I turned and gave one glance at the river house 70 feet behind me and up the steep hill, gauging whether I had time to run and awaken someone to get confirmation of what was happening. To arouse someone, I would have had to go hand over hand up the slope and consequently take my eyes off the thing I was watching. In the space of an instant, I decided that I could not cease observing. I tried to shout, but no sound came from my fear-constricted throat. The siren sound was gaining pitch, and in fact, everything seemed to be speeding up. The moving cloud was definitely growing larger rapidly, moving straight toward the place where I was. I felt my legs turn to water and sat down, shaking terribly. For the first time, I truly believed in all that had happened to us, and I knew that the flying concrescence was now about to take me. Its details seemed to solidify as it approached. Then it passed directly overhead at an altitude of about 200 feet, banked steeply upward, and was lost from sight over the edge of the slope behind me. In the last moment before it was lost, I completely threw open my senses to it and saw it very clearly. It was a saucer-shaped machine, rotating slowly, with unobtrusive, soft blue and orange lights. As it passed over me, I could see symmetrical indentations on the underside. It was making the whee, whee, whee sound of science fiction flying saucers. My emotions were all in a jumble. At first I was terrified, but the moment I knew that whatever was in the sky was not going to take me, I felt disappointment. I was amazed, and I was trying to remember what I had seen as clearly as possible. Was it real in the naive sense in which that question is asked of UFOs and tables and chairs? No one else saw this thing, as far as I know. I alone was its observer. I believe that had there been other observers, they would have seen essentially what I have reported. But as for real, who can say? I saw this thing go from being a bit of cloud to being a rivet-studded aircraft of some kind. Was it more true to itself as cloud or aircraft? Was it a hallucination? Against my testimony can be put my admitted lack of sleep and our involvement with psychedelic plants. Yet curiously, this last point can be interpreted in my favor. I am familiar through direct experience with most classes of hallucinogens. What I saw that morning did not fall into any of the categories of hallucinated imagery I am familiar with. Yet also against my testimony is the inevitable, incongruous detail that seems to render the whole incident absurd. It is that, as the saucer passed overhead, I saw it clearly enough to judge that it was identical with the UFO with 3 half-spheres on its underside that appears in an infamous photo by George Adamski, widely assumed to be a hoax. I had not closely followed the matter, but I accepted the expert opinion that what Adamski had photographed was a rigged-up end cap of a Hoover vacuum cleaner. But I saw this same object in the sky above La Chorrera. Was it a fact picked up as a boyhood UFO enthusiast? Something as easily picked out of my mind as other memories seem to have been? My stereotyped but already debunked notion of a UFO suddenly appears in the sky. By appearing in a form that casts doubt on itself, it achieves a more complete cognitive dissonance than if its seeming alienness were completely convincing. So, seems to be the unfolding of a literary structure. I think as you approach enlightenment, you become a linguistic black hole. And when you're finally enlightened, nobody can understand you at all because you have curved the continuum back around yourself. The fact that I think my living having people understand me convinces me I'm far from enlightenment. And the fact that it would destroy my income gives me the ability to even approach it. Creativity, if you analyze what do we mean when we say that, it basically means being able to transcend the ordinary. You see it in a way nobody else ever saw it, whatever it is, and so that's creativity. Psychedelics, by dissolving the boundaries of cultural expectation, let you see things in new ways. I was in a situation recently where it was evening, and silhouetted against the sky were flame cypress trees, but they were all black. And I was looking at them. I've seen flame cypress trees against twilight skies many times. You all have as well. And suddenly it was like there was this shift. And I didn't see it as a flame cypress tree anymore. I saw it as black dust pouring out of a certain point of the sky and cascading like a waterfall. And I was looking at 3 waterfalls of microfine black powder pouring out of points about 60 feet above the ground. Well, I didn't even mention it to the person I was with, but I just noticed this psychedelic perception. The other night, this was really interesting to me. The other night, just as I was falling asleep, a phrase came into my mind that I liked, but I didn't understand it. In fact, I didn't think it meant anything. I just thought it was an interesting phrase. And I thought about it for about a minute, and then it did this same thing that the flame cypress tree did. It went ploink, and this other dimension sprouted out of it, and I understood it, and I thought, this is a very interesting idea, and I've never thought it before. The thought was, if time were space, then history is a cobweb. That was all it was. But I don't take these leaps very often. So I was delighted because I knew a moment would come when I could lay it on a group of people like I've just done. So it's a catalyst for cognitive activity. That's what the mushroom is. Dance, drama, song, painting, body expression, creativity, and simply the passive act of understanding. This is what it does for us, and this is what we love to do. I mean, we are creatures of the mind. You know, they talk about virtual reality as some future technology that's going to change everything. We've been living in a virtual reality for the past 6,000 years. I mean, look at cities like New York and London and Los Angeles. I mean, every nature has disappeared. Everything you see is a human idea downloaded into material existence. It's entirely virtual. It doesn't disappear at the punch of a dial, but it is as virtual as the virtual realities that will eventually be made out of light behind goggles. Culture, the whole thing is that culture and language tend to become traps, and yet they can be the platforms for enormous freedom if you understand what it's all about. And what it's all about is you. You are the center of the mandala. You are not marginalized in any way. And the message that the culture gives us is that we are marginal. It doesn't matter whether if you've got $100 million. Fortune magazine will inform you that so do 10,000 other people on the North American continent. There's nothing special about you. And so we are constantly, this is part of the democratic legacy. We are constantly told, you're not special. Special isn't special. Anybody could do it. What the psychedelic, and so then when you look for guidance, direction, mentorship, we always look toward institutions. Well, I'll go to the university, or I'll go to the army, or I'll do something. Somebody will tell me, will give me a larger purpose. But it's really yourself that is the final arbiter. And if you keep yourself as the final arbiter, you will be less susceptible to infection by cultural illusion. Now, the problem with this is that it makes you feel bad to not be infected by cultural illusion because it's called alienation. You know, but this is, I can't solve all problems. The reason we feel alienated is because the society is infantile, trivial, and stupid. So the cost of sanity in this society is a certain level of alienation.
We're here. It's going well. Not like Aldor.
Now you're.
That's the maca.
That's the maca.
No, white.
All these people. Is this transcript, this whole thing?
Like, you can put it up if you want. I'm just recording.
Yeah, you should post it to the novelty list.
Yeah.
I mean, it's novel, right? And a lot of people on the novelty list.
Oh, there it is. The answer. The bicycle is supposed to transform into a sewing machine, but only if they are defended with operating table. Yes, smiling. You want to do some talking? Tell them.
We've changed into Zork. We're now Zork, the bug-eyed green lawnmower.
Oh, there. That's
Can
the
you see
character.
me? I'm up.
Yeah, well, people are coming and going. For the Macarena, I think it's time for me to go back to the U. Someone found an elf. Somebody's having a bad trip. Bizarre costumes. The city was packed with drunken costumed people, and there were bands playing in several different piazzas. It was like the masquerade balls you see in movies, except for rave music in one part of the city and ska in another. The fuzz, the snow crash.
I can do that. Let me get this.
And turn to the right.
Turn the camera to the right.
And click
Do I
there.
have to get rid of this one?
There we go.
There. Okay.
Here's what I'll do. I'll say, everyone, the transcript will be posted, and
Terrence,
pictures
what are you trying to face me
will be
again?
posted on the what site?
Decision site.
What's the URL? Do you know what it is?
What, of Levity?
Yeah.
Levity, it's
www.levity.com/eschaton.
Yeah.
Now you see. You mean it'll come apart into a marching band?
Or it'll clone other beings.
I've done that. But do you think, you don't sound like you're of the school that thinks that we're close to some kind of AI, and that when it goes over the threshold within a matter of hours, it will just inflate into some kind of thing that we can't even relate to and will be of no interest to?
No, I think, of course, it's hard, no one's defined intelligence and consciousness. I think that people underestimate the trial and error, the error proneness of living processes.
But on the other hand, the iteration speed of these machine life is so fast.
But there's a difference. The ecosystems that they're living in are extremely arid. They're basically life living in these very narrow tubes connected by very chancy processes.
You mean the wires?
The wires, and the servers and things, if that's how it stays. And whereas an ocean, an ocean with a billion trillion parallel processes and black smokers and super plumes going up and carrying life around is a massively different ecosystem, where you could have a lot of things happening at once on the same beast. A lot of reactions that happen at the same time. And I think the error rate is always the crippling factor. Why, for instance, did we invent all the science fiction? We invent something that eats all silicon, or that comes down to the earth and that eats all carbon-based lives, and we're all gone. And I think it doesn't happen because general purpose things are hard to. They're really ill-suited for survival. And then when you're specific purpose, you're prone to lots of errors.
Tell us when.
We're being recorded.